Good to go.
Fantastic.
Thank you for that.
Over to you.
Thank you. Sorry about that, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. And thank you so much to Gauteng Anthropology and Docu for giving me the opportunity. I'm really, really excited. I did say I don't want this research just to like be handed in and then it ends there. You know, I don't want it to gather dust. I do want it to be actionized in one way or another. I must apologize. I'm using earphones, but apologies for the background noise if you can hear anything. The beauty of doing this from home. So I think before we actually dive into it, because it's a pretty heavy topic, I just want to just quickly introduce myself and then situate the topic to why I chose this specific one to do, and sort of just give a bit of context. So I apologize if what I say is something you do know already. There just might be someone in the room who's just unaware of like certain things. So I will be explaining quite a few things as I go along. So firstly, the topic of my research is Are Women Human? And I will tell you a story straight after that about the topic, just to like break the ice a little bit. And it's on the gendering of the South African Police Service, and it looks at a brief examination of the current gender dynamics of a single subdivision of a select anti-human trafficking specialist force. So very, very concentrated, but obviously with the requirements of what I had to do and the word limits and the time that I had and access to resources, I obviously had to narrow it quite a bit. So, funny topic. So when I picked it, my supervisor was like, "Okay, cool. That's a pretty, you know, it's a really interesting topic. Are you sure that's what you want to name your research project?" And I was like, "Yeah, cool." And he was like, "Okay, cool. Why not?" And then when I actually had to reach out to different people, every single person, besides one or two, commented on how intense the title actually is. So I was like, yeah, but that's actually what I found out in this research. So who am I? Please just, before we start, can I just like welcome any interruptions? Please, I do want this to be a discussion, more of like a formalized presentation, if I'm allowed to do this, if I'm allowed to do that. But please just like interrupt me whenever you want to and just come in and let's actually discuss and learn and unlearn together. But my name is Alwande Khumalo. I am 23 years old. I did my honours degree at Wits University, and my honours research focused around briefly examining, as I mentioned earlier, a select anti-human trafficking specialized force, specifically the gender dynamics of the organizational structure and culture of that force. I will say which force it is soon. I have interest in state prevention and advocacy of human rights, gender studies, police, specifically ethical policing throughout the global south, Black Lives Matter, feminism, racial and cultural studies, mental health and youth inclusive advocacy. I have the privilege of wearing a few hats. I'm a single South African youth representative of Amnesty International's Youth Collective Youth Policy Action Network, a former co-chairperson at Amnesty International Wits, a former Women's Subcommittee Head, Amnesty International Wits, and a youth leader and SIRE's UN Youth Representative for last year. But I think over and above all of that, I think I am very hopeful, and I have the privilege of being pretty hopeful in humanity and our ability just to create a fairer, more equitable world for us all. And I do believe in people power, no matter how cringy and cheesy that sounds, and just action-orientated change. So, humanity. What is humanity? How does society create humanity? And how does humanity fits in and makes up society. So I just want to split this section up into two brief categories. The first one, I want to look at like an idealistic, realistic society. I was going to call it a utopia, but I think that will invoke a lot of arguments of if that's realistic or not. But please feel free to call it a utopia if you want to. And also South Africa, so liberated democratic South Africa in 2020. So this research was done last year, so that's the context of it. But when researching an ideal society, the thing that comes up again and again and again is linking democracy and democratic principles, obviously, to ideal societies. So everyone equates liberty to democracy, and of course that's a different conversation, but for just the interest of, I don't know, just to do it today, we're going to adopt that definition. So when we say of an ideal realistic society, we're speaking of a democratic society that consistently upholds democratic principles. Over and above that, according to the Vernal Project, it lists a couple of definitions of what a good, ideal, utopian society would be. And these characteristics include rudimentary democratic consent, so the establishment and maintenance of democratic institutions. Secondly, universal access to human essentials. So I personally interpret this as just the need for consistent upholding of human rights. Thirdly, access to other desirable items, obviously within reason and to certain extents. Freedom and liberty, equity, and not necessarily equality, which is a conversation we'll dive into just now, or we'll briefly just touch on that soon, and fairness, environmental sustainability, and lastly, balance. So that was pretty interesting, but it also further defined democracy by listing additional characteristics that are more morally based, and the most important ones were like humanity, compassion, democracy and responsibility, tolerance, wisdom, and very interestingly, and I think very importantly, fun. So I, as an individual, I don't know what authority I even have to do this, but I'm just going to personally add a couple or two more characteristics to this list if I can, because I do think true liberty is if every single person is enjoying equity, justice, and fairness at all times, not necessarily equality. So the first one would be, the first characteristic I would like to add is intersectionality. I think one of the biggest problems we have with policies and stuff is that the fact that they are so intersectional, and in the way we relate to one another and how we operate with each other is a lack of intersectionality there. And then a second characteristic is the need to make a transition towards equity and not necessarily equality. Now, I know that sounds really a little bit insane, but as we know, there is a big difference between equity and equality. And a lot of people assume that if everyone has equality, we would be truly free, whereby equality says everyone is given the exact same resources, and is treated the exact same way. And that is what equates fairness, whereby equity is everyone is given the resources that they need in order to level the playing field according to their circumstances and their individual context. So yeah, I think the biggest, easiest example of the difference between equity and equality is that you have a bunch of people, let's say 5 people, who are standing on one side of a wall, and their aim is that they want to see over the wall. So all these people are of different heights, and that's the people who are taller can see over the wall, and the people who are a little bit shorter cannot do so, and some who are a lot shorter cannot do so. So equality dictates that you give everyone the exact same stool, in order, including the very, very tall people and the very, very short people, and they just need to make do with that. But equity would be you give everyone the stool that is according to what they need, and some you don't even give some a stool because they wouldn't need it in that instance. So the shortest people will get the tallest stool, and etc., etc., etc. But enough about that. Now let's quickly do an activity. I really hope this won't take too long. I'm going to time it. Hopefully it will only take 1 minute, and I'll cut it in the interest of time. And yeah, but if we can just grab an A4 piece of paper, or just anything we can draw with, and then sort of make just like 2 A5 pieces of paper and just grab a quick pen on them. Then I'm going to tell you what to do with the paper, and then I'll just give 30 seconds for everyone to do that. Okay, now with the 2 A5 pieces of paper, the first piece of paper is going to be listed as first. And then the second one is going to be listed as second. And then you're just going to make a horizontal line, just draw a line down, a vertical line, all the way down, so that you separate the 1 A5 piece of paper into 2 smaller blocks. And then the first one is, you can label it A, and the second one B. So you just want to separate the piece of paper so that your A4, the original A4 piece of paper, now has 4 different blocks. And then the first 2 blocks is titled first, and then the second 2 blocks are titled as second. So you have 1A, 1B, and 2A, 2B. Then once you've done that, just take the second piece of paper and just put it very close by, but we will not use that right now. We'll use it soon. And then if you can pick up the first piece of paper, and that's what we're going to use now, and your pen close by. So if everyone can just do that, give everyone like 10 seconds to do that. Sorry if you have to run up and down. And then we'll touch on that soon. Okay, cool. So now that the papers are all ready, I'm just assuming that they are, let's move on. Now, I think context is really important, and contextualizing everything is extremely, extremely important. So before we actually do a deep dive into this work, I just want to contextualize South Africa and just go back and look at what the Republic of South Africa looks like in 2020 and what this means for society and humanity in society. So as some of us know, that we became a democracy officially in 1994, April 1994. We had elections from the 26th to the 29th of April. That's why the 27th of April every single year is celebrated as Freedom Day in South Africa, that annual public holiday. So these were groundbreaking elections because it was the first elections that took place whereby every single citizen of all racial groups or races were allowed to take part, thereby making a physical representation of liberty via democracy. So the elections just quick, the ANC won, with Nelson Mandela being the first democratic president of South Africa. And I think about 19.5 million people voted. So that was pretty impressive, and this obviously is after South Africa's. These were the first democratic elections from the racially unjust apartheid past of South Africa. Now, a key point in these elections, and a build-up, a couple of years to these elections, were drafting what we now know as the Supreme Law of Liberated South Africa. And we actually went from, we got like a whole rename, we got a new name from South Africa to the Republic of South Africa. And this liberated Supreme Law is all drafted within the Constitution of South Africa. Fun fact, the Constitution, the 1996 Constitution, the one that we use today in South Africa, was actually the 5th Constitution that was drafted. So we had a few interim constitutions. They were drafted a bit by Parliament, but this one was drawn up and it was used in the South African general elections of 1994 and was drawn up by the Parliament of 1994. So the Constitution, as we said, provides the supreme legal foundation for the existence of the Republic. It lays out the rights and responsibilities of the public and of the citizens and also non-citizens, or every single person here, and also defines the structures of the South African government and the different spheres of government and how they relate differently and how they are interrelated. So as we said, the current constitution, I'm just going to be referring to it as the constitution, but it's the 1996 constitution, signals that we actually have, lays out that we have a constitutional democracy. Okay, so now, what was the points of all of that? So the constitution lays out the different governance as different spheres of government that we have, the different democratic institutions that we also have. Now, according to before we get there, let's actually just touch on the economic intelligence report. This constitution is actually, it does pretty well. You know, it can do better. I feel like if you're not number one, you can always do better. It's a little bit toxic, but it does well so far. You know, it is referred to consistently, even by states that are deemed as being perfect and upholding human rights. So very like Scandinavian states look up to it, mirror it in certain ways and stuff. And the Economics Intelligence Unit of 2020 Democracy Index reports actually scored South Africa's democracy an overall 7.5 out of 10, so making it the fourth highest in the sub-Saharan African category. So last year was not a great democratic year. I think last year for SA was not great at all, and to get the fourth highest was pretty remarkable considering everything that took place last year. But a key component of any ideal society, any ideal realistic society, is the establishment of ethical and up to standard order and mechanisms and institutions to enforce law in an ethical standard, right? Now, police is a big part of society. I always argue, and I have argued, that there is a place in utopia for police, state security, intelligence, and all of that. But I think the way that we have seen that is the problem. You know, the state of the South African police service is a problem. The fact that majority of us actually refer to police services as police forces, you know, and in very like hectic, militarized, hyper-masculine synonyms is a bit of a problem. So a big problem, actually. So the 1996 Constitution recognized that there's a need for police and security services in order to enforce and instill and control democracy. And I think it's chapter 11, security services, section 205 to 208, basically lays out the supreme law of the police service, so the supreme, like the overall duties and responsibilities, rather, of the police service, political responsibility, control of the police service, and the police civilian secretariat. So what it laid out is who the SAPS is, what will the SAPS do, how will the SAPS function, and how will they fit within society. And a big thing it highlights is that the police is actually a form of service delivery. They are people who deliver services to humanity and to the society of people in South Africa. So this highlights that there definitely is a need for police, you know, but as we said, what we want, we do not want forces. We do not want hyper-militarized sort of FISMA's full Marikana 1976 type of, just like, I don't even think we have the vocabulary to accurately describe how aggressive the SAPS is in South Africa, but the police service is in South Africa. But we definitely do not want that. We want a whole rebuttal of that. So being someone who's really interested in policing and human rights, state preservation, and also I would like to think that I sort of understand politics, I thought that why don't we look at how, and being an intersectional Black feminist, why don't I look at how much gender equality takes place in the SAPS? That's what I said. So I assumed a bit of gender equality took place. And that's how I got to this topic. And I wanted to be like, let's say I wanted to get into the police. How would that work for me? How are past, former, and potential police women actually treated in SAPS? And what barriers do they face to not allow them to do their work? And why do we see police women of SAPS taking very stereotypically feminine responsibilities, which are important, but if they're important, then everyone in society should do them. Do you know what I mean? So they take out the very behind the desk administrative, writing of statements type of role. And why are policemen usually the ones who are kicking down the doors? They are the ones who are, progressing in the SAPs and getting into these specialized forces. So that was the assumption. That was a hypothesis for this research. Let's see what we did. Now, if we can just pick up our piece of paper, the first piece of paper, we're going back to the activity now, and I am just going to read out two examples. The first example is going to be under A, so the first example, and then the second example is going to be under B. And I just want us to maybe close our eyes just for like 2 seconds and just think about this before we answer. You can draw what you want to draw. Your answer can be a drawing, it can be a couple of words, it can be one word. You'll see, but just jot your answer down, please. So I'm going to assume that we all have a piece of paper and a pen. Scenario 1. So please just think about it before, don't rush into your answer, just allow your thoughts to actually process. But the first scenario is that you're at a police station and you're there to sort of give very administrative evidence. So someone's going to come and take your statement, so you're going to go write a statement, you're going to be answered some questions to a pretty high profile investigation, but it's the beginning of it, we're still gathering evidence. Now, there is a single police officer in the evidence gathering room, so in the police room. And what does that police officer look like? What is the assumed gender of that police officer? What is their race? It can also be assumed race, assumed age. Just describe the police officer you see. I'm also actually gonna do it. Okay, that's the first one. The second scenario is that you're walking on the street for some reason. I don't know where you're going. You're just on the street, and a high speed chase speeds past you, and something is happening pretty close to you, sort of like a movie like kicking and busting sort of situation. And you see cars that are labeled with hawks, so hawk specialized cars, and just high leveled police cars, when the police drive like your BM, like your private security type of cars. Those police officers that they use in Fees and I'm talking about those ones, the very like high level specialized police. Okay, you see a group of those police officers. So obviously something big is going down. You see the commanding officers in front of you. Okay, it's very obvious who's the one in charge in that situation because all of this is unfolding right next to you. Can you describe the commanding officers that you see? You can even just describe one commanding officer, it doesn't matter. Can you describe their assumed gender, their assumed race, their assumed just everything, assumed visible characteristics that you can see? So I'm just going to count 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so now just put that to the side and we will pick that up later on. It's not supposed to make sense right now, but hopefully it will make sense afterwards. So now that we've established that police officers are actually really, really needed in society, and like it is a democratic institution that is needed, but obviously we want ethical policing, right? What do we mean when we say ethical policing? What does an ethical police service look like? What does an ethical SAPS look like? Is it reflective of the society? Is it reflective to the skills and responsibility? The skills and expertise that the society has. What are we dealing with? Top down, who is the head of those police officers? Who are the national commissioner? Who are the brigades, the detectives that are like, looked at very, very highly. Who's also at the bottom of those police officers? What does that ethical police structure actually look like? Who progresses? Who doesn't progress? Why are the people who progress? Is there some sort of pattern that we can get there? And an important policing question, there is no way I can speak about this without mentioning this question, but it's this whole who guards the guardians. So why does SAPS look the way that it does? Who does SAPS answer to? Is the SAPS that we have in 2021 reflective of the plus minus 27 years of democracy that we've had in South Africa? If I was not from here and I came here as a tourist or whatever, if I just came here and I saw SAPS, I could be like, this is the type of society that that is in South Africa. This is what South African society is about. Okay, so a key question to this research was looking at whether specialized police forces, a single one rather, police force within the South African police service is monolithic, static, and negative, or if it's completely opposite to that, and if it's rightfully so, or if it's not, just like what is going on there and why does it look the way it does. Now, police scholar Professor Jennifer Brown argues that police services had long operated under unproven assumptions that women were and unsuitable for police work. Moreover, Brown argues that other studies claim that not only was the public throughout the whole international system of states accepting of police women into their respective forces, but that female victims or victims who are women of crime generally lean towards favoring the assistance of police women and were strongly in favor of the notion that police women were better at providing practical advice and assistance to all victims and or survivors of crime. These kinds of arguments inform the case for the development of more progressive police forces, which equally include the recruitment, placing, promotional opportunities, recognition, and leadership of police women. An example of such a progressive police force, and I really, let me just pause here. I also like contextualizing things and using global South examples for the global South. But there's not one, there's not an ideal police force in the African region. So maybe that's something that could also be a different project. But it would be the Federal Criminal Police in Germany, specifically within the year 2008, whereby a third of their officer makeup, so people top, middle, bottom, everywhere, admin, hardcore policing sort of like, like spokes policing, so like sort of office policing were a third of those. The whole police service were women. So Brown further argues that women in Africa have and or are still working towards establishing and maintaining a policewoman corps. However, such aims are repeatedly met with abusive, stereotypical assumptions and accusations that women are incapable of dealing with criminals and criminality in general. Yet a reality of the statuses of trafficking in newly emerging nations consistently call for a push towards the recruitment of police women in many forces. Furthermore, Brown also argues that in post-colonial African states, policing models were largely structured from the patterns established by the former colonial powers. So context is really important too. So we said the year 2020 marks 27 years of democratic liberty for the Republic of South Africa. The 1996 Constitution of SA formally states that South Africa as a whole ought to, and I quote, adopt this constitution as a supreme law of the Republic, to A, heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. B, lay the foundations of a democratic and open society in which government is based on the will of the people and every citizen is equally protected by the law. C, improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person. And lastly, build a united and democratic state able to take its rightful position as a sovereign state in a family of nations. Now, this research asks a couple of questions, but it asks, is democratic South Africa a state that allows for the equality of every single human being, regardless of their gender identification, amongst other identification? Thus, is South Africa truly equal for women in highly masculine spaces, in spaces that you would assume just embody everything that's wrong with society, if I can say so freely, such as within the Hawks SOCI force. Now, that's the force that we're going to be looking at today. And just a quick breakdown of the Hawks. So, obviously, the Hawks is, I would argue, the most specialized type of police that we have in SA. Now, the Hawks is, it's commonly known as the Hawks, but their formal name is the Directorate for Priority Crime Investigations. And the SOCI unit, which is a unit that I'm going to be looking at, is a serious organized crime investigations, which is a subdivision of the Hawks. Now, more specifically, the task force that I'm going to be looking at within that subdivision is the Anti-Human Trafficking Police Force. Okay, and I specifically picked that force because there's quite a bit of research on it already. It's garnered quite a bit of interest, and it's one where one could assume would have quite a few women in it. Okay, it's sort of like ideal in the sense that it's the crime of human trafficking is gendered, but policing should not be gendered, but it's gendered. You'll see. It's a pretty interesting one. So another question that I also wanted to ask was, is democratic South Africa a safe and equal space for women in traditional hypermasculine spaces, such as within the task force? Are selective specialized SAPS units of the Democratic Republic generally founded on non-sexist values that are not only safe for women, but are just towards women? So what does it mean to be a female protection officer, a woman protection officer within a select South African anti-human trafficking police force? What does it look like? What's the organizational culture? What's the organizational structure? And is it a safe space for you? So there's quite a few things here, but this research explores the current democratic nature of police culture throughout the Republic. And obviously, we can assume off the bat that it is intensely dominated by a culture of toxic, cis, heteronormative, masculine normativity only. This culture is argued to create and or foster an environment which is both unattractive to women and consistently affirms a quote-unquote cult of masculinity throughout all tiers of SAPS, especially within specialized forces. Moreover, the research focal points of this research was, as we said, the single select highly prestigious anti-human trafficking Hawks SOCI force. And yes, we want to analyze that force, but we also want to use it as an example of an analytical mirror of both the South African Police Service and the South African society in general. Although that's pretty ambitious, but I think we can draw some similarities there. So I asked, if women are treated as co-human beings as opposed to subhuman beings, that means that women are going to be treated not only equally, but with all of the levels and elements of equity, right? Like, that goes without saying, one would think. Now let's tap into human trafficking and look at why we looked at anti-human trafficking, like when there are so many other crimes that exist. Excuse me, I'm just going to drink some water. But let's dive into human trafficking a little bit. So human trafficking is a pretty serious organized crime. South Africa is actually a hotspot for human trafficking in terms of like origin, transit, destination. There are several human rights violations that take place with the crime. Human trafficking isn't just characterized as sexual exploitation or sexual slavery, even though that is a big form of human trafficking. It's actually seen as one of the most, and please excuse me for saying this is a quote, one of the most attractive forms of serious crimes. Very weird, but I mean, you know, like Hollywood does that quite a bit with like romanticizing human trafficking via Taken, Lost, Wanted, those type of movies. But it's gotten quite a bit of interest with a couple of international organizations actually planting their roots in SA to sort out human trafficking. But a global anti-human trafficking organization, A21, reports that human trafficking is estimated to be a highly profitable organized crime, specifically crime that generates an estimated, it is specifically an estimated, 150 billion US dollars every single year. Of equal importance, the Global Trafficking in Person Report, TIP, which is sort of like the world's most comprehensive resource of government anti-human trafficking efforts. It's like a diplomatic tool that is created by the US government every single year, and it summarizes human trafficking in quite a few countries that are deemed as hotspots or that have any form of reported human trafficking that takes place. And it looks at the global assessments of government's measures to both preemptively and responsibly act towards elimination of trafficking in persons within their respective regions. So that's what it is. So it is created by the US government, but it is recognized within SA. So we also use it quite a bit. We are in 2020, we will basically, so it shows the levels of human trafficking and explores it through by putting different countries in different tiers. So SA in 2020 was in tier number 2, and tier number 2 is a tier that's made up of countries who do not meet the Trafficking Victims Prevention Act's minimum standards, but are making significant efforts to bring themselves into compliance with those standards. Okay, so you could even fall under tier 2 if you've had a breakthrough case in human trafficking type of thing, and so that's essentially what that is. So that's important just to define and contextualize human trafficking. But globally, again, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime dubbed South Africa as a hotspot for human trafficking by saying, and I quote, "The Republic of South Africa is a primary destination for trafficked persons in the Southern African region and within Africa at large. It's also an origin and transit country for trafficking towards Europe and North America." And it says that trafficking affects women, men, and children, so people who find themselves exploited for the purposes of forced labor, forced sex, forced begging, and forced criminality in general. Additionally to this, the Global CT Data Collaborative Organization argues that historically, most identified victims of human trafficking are women. So it basically estimates that on average, 70% of the people, remember, we don't have every single stat of every single person who is human trafficked, but of what we have, this is what we found. This is what they found. 70% of the people on average are women or girls, or those who identify as that. 20% are male, or those who identify as that, and the 5% are slotted under a category which is titled as unknown. And it could just be people are not sure of their gender identification for a number of reasons. So human trafficking affects women more than anyone, and which is pretty important because I said, okay, statistically, even assumedly, human trafficking is a crime that predominantly affects women and those who identify as women or girls, and that is in essence a gendered organized crime. Now, the link to hawks. How is such a gendered organized crime best fought against with a sexist and unequal task force, and a task force that is made up of an underrepresentation of women, such as within what's happening with the hawks? That just doesn't make sense. I can tell you, I'm not a security expert, and me, 23 years old, just know that already just does not make sense. So how progressive is this force? Is this force even progressive? Just what is going on? Yeah. But before we tap in there, because I obviously know that not all of us even know what SAPS is the history of SAPS and why SAPS operates the way we do. I'm just going to quickly go through the history of SAPS. I'm going to speed through it because I actually want to get to the concepts and the policing and practice. But the methods and the ethics that were taken was that for this research, a lot of archive desk-based research had a couple of challenges, with one of them being that I couldn't access quite a few of governmental stats because I don't want to say the government wasn't cooperating, but I do. Just with giving data and whatever, even though I was like, I will, this will also help you, but that's a separate conversation, but yeah. So I accessed quite a few archive desk research, but I also had the absolute privilege of interviewing 4 people who were all experts according to the concepts of what this research looked at. I interviewed someone who was an anti-human trafficking trafficker, an anti-human trafficker who was affiliated to the National Freedom Network, which is just like an umbrella organization based in SA, and it's made up of different organizations who work together to fight human trafficking. So this person has been a high-level professional at the National Freedom Network for the past 8 years actually. The second interviewee was a fantastic gender expert and academic from the University of Johannesburg, and was just literally framed this research, provided both a gendered qualitative and quantitative aspects to this research. They've been a gendered expert for a few years. And then the third interviewee was a past anti-human trafficking investigator for Love Justice, who was for 5 years. And Love Justice is just an international anti-human trafficking organization, and they were chosen to participate in this research as they provided first-hand accounts of being a woman security personnel and an anti-human trafficking investigator. So they are what the Hawks SOCI is supposed to be for the States. The fourth and the final interviewee was actually a previous member of the Hawks' SOCI team, and he, her, he, she, or they, let me not gender this person, worked here for 5 years, worked in that force for 5 years. They don't work there anymore. They are retired from this force, and they are currently an anti-human trafficking expert, and they both serve as a current international consultant and a current prolific professional at the National Freedom Network. So that's sort of the people who gave me like first-hand experience, which I had the absolute privilege of doing so. So now to just quickly briefly summarize SAPS and why does SAPS look like how it looks now. So as we said, an ample amount of research has shown that there are many police women that wish to achieve positions in highly specialized traditional masculine task forces. Not all, but a lot, including within the Hawks SOCI task force. The South African Police Service, SAPS, was restructured when South Africa transitioned into democracy in 1994. This trend was marked with creating the old South African Police, so SAP, through, and they were known as the South African Police Force, but we just called them SAP, through the unification of 10 police services of the homeland into a single, large, unified national police service. This newly established SAPS was established in terms of the Sax Act 68 of 1995. SAP was further restructured by the introduction of the newly liberated Republic of South Africa, Act 108 of 1996. Please come at me if those acts are incorrect. So within this constitution, Section 9, subsection 3 of this constitution affirms the responsibilities of the Republic. And it actually says there, to not unfairly discriminate directly or indirectly against anyone on one or more grounds, including race, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, ethnic or social origin, rather, color, sexual, even though race is there anyways, sexual orientation, age, disability, religion, conscious, even, which is like hello, belief, culture, language, or birth. So here the Constitution vehemently speaks against the restrictive operationalization of gender discrimination for all sectors of society, including for the SAP. So it says the democratic institutions have to be non-gendered, non-racial, just they need to be non-discriminatory. It's classified like that. Of equal importance would be the current gender discrimination that exists within the South African SOCI task force, of which was reported earlier as being both systemically gender discriminatory towards potential capable policewomen within SAPS's constitutional democracy, and also by having various barriers and just having like a toxic, highly masculine police division. Now, I must pause by saying when we say highly masculine, I don't think personally there's anything wrong, like to obviously be that. And I think as scholars, we need to open our mind to that. But I think the minute your identities bar other people from them living out their identity in authentic fashions, that's when there's a bit of an issue. Okay, so that's why I keep saying toxic in front of it. Sorry, I should have put that in the beginning. So let's start from the 1970s. So SAP and SAPS was classified by from this research. In this research, I classified it as through the lens of military. What do you call that thing? Militarization. So I looked at militarization, demilitarized, and remilitarized. So I just started from 1970s just because I was like, yeah, I need to cap it eventually. But when was the biggest sort of, quote unquote woke thing that happened in SAPS? And in the 1970s, Esther Boisrop's influential work primarily focused on the need to challenge the past norm for the purposes of the authentic inclusion of women in development. So we have our WID. So WID happened, took place, everyone was excited about it. However, theoretically it was great, practically not too great because the implementation of WID was slow paced, and that other approaches came about and they encouraged WID to be explored, but through different ways that moved away from the whole, add woman and stir approach to the more genuine woman in development type of thing. So it moved away from tokenism. So that took place. And this happened for quite a while, but only in 1972, and I want to say this in the beginning, even though it doesn't make chronological sense right now, but in 1972, which was a mere 49 years ago, a calculated recruitment of only white women were put into the old South African police force, so SAP. And so they were like, yeah, we do have women, but they had, I think, like 3 white women, so was good. But the women police officers of other racial categories were recruited only from 1980s. Okay. So the South African police force was established in after 1913 upon gaining independence from colonial Britain. The SAP was centralized and vastly bureaucratic, and that's how it operated as a police organization. The decision and operationalization of the SAP mirrored the organization and practices of Ireland's martial colonial policing body, which was the Royal Irish Constabulary, I think, something like that. The SAP was governed by the Military-Based Defence Act of 1917 and the Police Act of 1912 and 1912. This was done as intentional means to control the presumed possibility of South Africa's then presumed unrest and rebellious nature that was present during apartheid. That was argued to be present during apartheid. A practical means to the implementation of this military mandate was, for instance, how was the SAPS members, was the fact that police officers during this time, they doubled as police officers as well as soldiers. So they were sometimes conscripted for war. So it just shows how militarized SAPS was. But 1920 saw the emerged establishment of the Union of South Africa. Here, South Africans of color started being moved into spatial zones that were predominantly restricted for white South Africans. But with the rise of Afrikaans nationalism in 1948, apartheid became the formal role of governance throughout South Africa, and retired English police were traded in for Afrikaans police. So that's how we saw that change start to happen. These police also saw the appointment of black police officers. However, these police officers were largely intentionally recruited from rural areas and worked for very low salary, little to none labor rights, and held actually no authority over white police and civilians, while simultaneously having had received widespread support in townships until 1976. So very covert appointments here. 1970s was a decade of reformation for the SAP. Here, SAPs reformed in response to the heightened levels of protest and discontent in traditionally segregated black communities, and the then commitment to unfolding liberation movements against oppressions. Further, throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Homeland Police forces were formed. Okay, big move. These forces were largely made up of members from the SAP, and these members were specifically chosen as they were seen as either to be black, skilled, and loyal to the implementation of a budget of lucrative white senior police officers who had the support of the homelands. So, yeah. After witnessing mammoth levels of violence in the 1960s and facing various forms of pressure, the SAP began to racially reform. The implementation of police militarism was further fixed in the 1980s rather, with the government's execution of a state centered form of statecraft, and it was called strategy. This strategy aimed at obliterating the presumed and confirmed communist ideology in South Africa. It was carried out, again, militarized and joined SAP and SADF Defence Force efforts, having launched heightened levels of brutality in volatile black townships, again, the targeting of black individuals. This was popularly done with the continuous use of live ammunition to disband protests. In the early 1980s, the SAPS was inspired by various international policing models and local academics to form the first community policing structure within this force. This saw a division of community relation, which is a big thing, because current SAPS actually value sort of like community policing now, which is interesting. Not vigilantism, but community policing forums. And these were established by the SAP in the year 1992. This division expanded by establishing various local police community forums. Excuse me for that thing. This initiative did not receive popular support from the black community, as this division deployed several former security branch officers, but the move was vitally strategic, as by the early 1990s, SAPS was a police force that was brutal, that was, and like, I don't even think, they were like brutal, corrupt, and like inhumane. It was crazy. For instance, visible policing was disproportionately responded with brutal bias against the rights of black individuals. Criminal investigations were heavily reliant on unethical confessions that were received under duress or level different forms of like Guantanamo Bay level torture and the pressure of international, and because of the pressure of international seclusion, because obviously apartheid was happening, this was a primary reason as to why the SAPS's procedures and processes started to reform. Okay. So 1990s, some scholars such as Guy Lam assess that the demilitarized efforts were attempted in the 1990s. Simultaneously, the South African police responded to heightened crime levels and the occurrences of crime with large-scale, high-density operations in partnership with the South African military. So they stole this form of militarization. So, i.e., people who SAP said you are good enough to be a soldier, good enough to be a police officer, were soldiers. So that's sort of what's going on. Through prioritizing, initiating operations in areas of high violence, the implementation of curfews, the wage of razor wires to seal off hostiles and informal settlements, of which were targeted as hotspots for crime, resources were further militarized, and this is when the high presence of those armored vehicles, police vehicles, became a thing. Okay, and for instance, police vehicles started actually changing from the police vans we have today to, just like military military vans we have where a police officer will get inside and sort of rotate that AK-47. So yeah, and they basically say we need the arguments actually implementing these forms of military resources was that people were saying, SAPS officials were saying at that time, Black people are using shotguns and around us. They're not just using stones. That's a lie. So we need AK-47s because they said that they needed to defeat that. So demilitarization efforts started to unfold, but visibly so, but only visibly so. So demilitarization was prioritized to be implemented in police badges, the police structures, the police by structures, I mean the ranking system and the police uniforms. And there was just transition from taking away the use of automatic firearms and armored personnel carriers to just adopting a more human rights-centered, community-orientated approach to training. So that was sort of done, and national transformation ensued throughout SAPS. So now we're over here. National transformation ensued throughout SAPS, where throughout South Africa rather, with the implementation of democratic rule in the 1990s. So 1994, the interim constitution of 1994 basically detailed plans to install community police forums at every single police station. Okay, and then with 1995.
Sorry, Alwande, just
Sure.
timekeeping. Your first hour is up.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks for that. Let me speed it up. So yeah, the South African police force stopped becoming a force on paper and actually started to transition and became a South African police service. Okay, so, and that happened in 1995 with the implementation of SAPS in 1995, which you can see over there. And this was a really, really great act. I mean, you could look it up when you have some time. We can't go through all of that right now, but other important, elements of demilitarization took place with just focusing on community oversight forums, implementing just a couple of all of these things. So basically, drastic changes were made, but there was never really a focus on changing rooting out the sexism and the discriminatory practices against women, especially women of color, throughout SAPS. So that's the point. I mean, it's this wave of militarism and then demilitarization and then militarism again. I mean, 2016 is a really, really big thing, and it's basically the latest, not really the latest, but one of the key approaches of remilitarization that we have in SAPS, where they were told to go back to basics approach, whereby people were equating, the then police minister in 2017, or Minister Figlin Balula, was equating criminality to terrorism. Very US thing. So it was that type of thing, and saying, like root out, they say like criminals are running amok, just using very drastic language and sort of like shoot to kill language type of thing. So that's where SAPS actually, that's the whole formation of SAPS. So the policing that we're going to adopt is just the definition of policing is just any constitutionally accepted body or institution, rather, that ethically enforces law and order and as a form of the criminal justice system. Human trafficking, we're going to look at the PACTO Act version. So it's basically just identifies human trafficking very, very explicitly, and it defines human trafficking as the transit, the organization of, and the criminality involving someone else, but it also focuses on the psychological, the emotional, as well as the physical aspects of it. So it's basically one of the most socially conscious definitions that we have of human trafficking. But let's go into the concepts and the findings. So I've linked them together. So which I'm going to explain each concept, and then I'm going to go through each finding. But I'm just going to pause for a second because just to gather myself again. So, policing and practice. What does policing and practice look like here? So we're going to look at the current structure of SAPS and that it operates in a strict linear organizational structure. We're going to look at Atker's theory of gendered organization and intersectionality, as well as the absence of intersectionality, and what does that mean for this specific task force. So inspired by Matthias' probably most popular quote would be that the higher you go, the fewer women you see in positions in society. And this holds quite a bit of truth, and this research showed that. It showed that the higher the individual ranks in organizations, the fewer women are respectfully, authentically, and truly positioned within organization. So it says that within organizations, rather. So here we saw that the organization in question, obviously the SAPS at large, and specifically the Hawks' SOCI force, is not only a subsection of the Hawks, but is representative of the police force, largely. And what this research basically aimed to focus on was the current gender dynamics within this subdivision, and looked at how police women were treated. What is that culture? Can they progress? Do they want to progress? And what does gender equality look like there? And how democratic is that that force actually operated within? But we obviously define what policing is, and so please just keep all the definitions at the back of your mind. So the ultimate purpose of SAPS as a policing service of South Africa is to always serve and create a safe and protected environment in every single area of South Africa that ought to carry out service delivery to every single citizen of who is in South Africa. SAPS as an organization aims to bring about and maintain such safety and protection through preventing crime, ensuring that offenders are brought to justice, investigating any crimes, and participating in efforts to address the causes of crime. But SAPS, it's weird because SAPS's vision, mission, values, and code of conduct lays out the aims, their objectives, and the promises that the SAPS as an organization undertakes and swears to uphold. But SAPS is set to achieve all of this through a currently presiding strict linear organizational structure. So it's not matching. This structure is made up of a single entry system of recruitment. Career progression is advanced from like a bottom-up hierarchical rank-based progression. And this structure is founded by the principle of time serving, which states that the more time you actually put into your work and the more hours you clock, the more the more like dedicated you are to your job, and the better of an officer you are. And that holds some weights, but not always. Some people don't have the luxury to work full time. Some people don't have the luxury to clock in overtime all the time. Some people don't have the luxury to go on the field. Some people don't have the luxury to not go on the field, type of thing. So there's a bit of issues there, but an intensified problem with rank-based hierarchical organization is that there are various limitations that it calls for, and it safeguards those limitations and those restrictions. So these limitations tend to greatly affect marginalized groups, as there's most injustice in the world. One of such limitation is the notion that the chances of progression are greatly limited. And we'll dive into how it actually happens. But a second limitation is that organizations highlight are that the role that assumptions play in the granting of promotions. So for instance, within this force, what happens is that you are picked out. This is how the Hawks is run. So you have to have about, I think, 3 to 5 years of detective uniform experience, and then someone else comes and picks you out. Someone of the Hawks picks you out and says, we want you to be a Hawks officer, you must undergo training, as opposed to everyone undergoing training, and then the people who perform the best, get promoted in that sense. So there's a couple of assumptions that go by to you even accessing the opportunity. And the person who's picked out is generically known as being not very socially conscious and sort of assumes policing with the policeman, and policemen in general. So that's a big problem that happens with that. So, and with the strict linear structure, there is no way to sort of fix that. There's no way to move around it. It's this is what you do. This is step 2. This is step 3. This. That's how it goes. So that's a big problem within here, and that was actually highlighted by one of the interviewees, who actually stated that when he was in the force, and he was in the force for a while, he stated that the most women that were there, the highest number of women that were in those force were 2 out of approximately 40 specialized police officers. So 2 of them were women, and then the other 40 were men. And he said that what happens is that they go in training and they identified a couple of people who they said they could maybe possibly be trained and get the good skills and, expertise. So there's a lot of just like COVID manipulation, if I can say that. I know that's a very intense assumption and a very intense thing to say, but that's what's going on. If you are assuming things on someone else, you are manipulating the process and ultimately manipulating democratic institutions as a whole. So that was a big thing. Now, another person who came up over here and said that why this is such a big problem would be a scholar, Fidling, who spoke of the cult of masculinity and said that the cult of masculinity basically says it's created by stereotypical hegemonic masculine standards, and says that these standards are based off of stereotypical cis hetero masculine standards of aggression, physicality, and competitiveness. So a bit of the negative ones. And Fidling basically argued that such highly macho specialized police forces are underpinned by such disastrous stereotypical cis hetero hegemonic masculine standards. So why is that's definitely undemocratic, that's very sexist, that's very exclusionary, and it completely goes against our constitution and various other forms of legislation. And on a good day, if your police force has 2 to 40 policewomen to policemen ratio, you can already assume that that is not reflective of the society that you are forcing, especially in a type of police that actually you have to gender some of the work that goes on there because of the type of and the intricacies of that organized crime. So, and this was highlighted by an interviewee who was the woman police anti-human trafficker, who actually was on the ground like rescuing women with one of the organizations. And this person said that she knows a quote, she knows of a situation where a victim of human trafficking was found by a male and a female officer, policewoman, and the victims clearly indicated that she was very grateful that the policewoman was present, as the policewoman was caring and understanding, and she was very unresponsive to the policeman because of the trauma that she had suffered. So thereby reiterating that there is a need and there's definitely enough room for all of us at the table here. Now, Akka's theory of gendered organization basically just cements everything that was said. And Joan Akka, who's an organizational theorist, primary tenant in the theory of gendered organization, states that very interesting actually, but organizations are not in fact gender neutral, but she argues that rather organizations are primary negative divisive tools that are used to negatively divide, create, exploit, perpetrate, preserve gender divisions, thereby perpetuating gender microaggressions from the very point that they are created. So whereby in this case, the microaggressions would be like SAPS was created before people were even recruited to be discriminatory towards men. And that's what a couple of, interviewees said. One of the interviewees actually said that you need to remember that a lot of the time at high profile positions such as the Hawks, where most police officers actually strive to get to, because it's a pretty good job for police officers, is that they handpick people before training takes place, and those handpicked people undergo training and are then engulfed in the unit if the training goes successfully. So the one who holds the power in identifying and handpicking the police officers is the one who holds the power by saying, okay, you are worthy of the opportunity to be trained and that's molded in this ideal police worker for this specific police force. So they have this like sort of ungovernable form of power. Do you know what I mean? That's what's going on over here. That was further highlighted by intersectionality. And the gender expert who was interviewed highlighted that a big thing that organizations do not actually take into consideration is the fact that they already assume certain things before people even get there, thereby there are various ways to bar women from even entering into the workplace, let alone trying to get promotional opportunities. And one of the way would be by saying, oh, okay, no, we're not going to hire you. Oh, she's probably just going to get pregnant in 6 months. No, if we want a woman, okay, we need this type of woman. We need to make sure that this sort of is ticked on the list and this quota is sort of met. So that's a big thing. And for those who don't know, intersectionality is a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes like compound themselves, and they create obstacles that are often not understood within conventional ways of thinking about with the social justice advocacy structures we have, and bars the various identities that we consistently hold, and only focuses on a couple of identities that we have. So the Hawks SOCI force was very unintersectional in the sense that the 2 to 40 ratio of police were the Hawks. That force did well when that ratio was present. So obviously it was very unintersectional in that. Now, I just quickly want to skip the current positioning of police. We'll come back to that there. And I want to attach intersectionality to the barrier of part-time and police women, and the dichotomy of police women versus police women, whereby a lot of police officers actually stated, and this was actually said by some of the interviewees, when police women have a lot more barriers facing them and in progressing within very specialized forces, but even in just like normal SAPs, in the sense that they have different responsibilities that they traditionally need to cater to. Let's take, for instance, a mom who is a single mom. That person is a mom first before they're a police officer. So obviously they're punching in a lot fewer hours, and their work is sort of very low leveled because of the risk that they will hold, because they are now the mother of someone, they are the parents of someone. So everyone's sort of afraid to send them to the field, but also they're not getting enough time to prove that they are worthy of doing so. So that's one barrier that was put up. Another barrier was just the absence of intersectionality, which obviously links to the barrier that we said, and just the fact that people actually within this unit said that women actually need to play an active role in combating human trafficking, because it is such a dangerous job that people do not have the time when they're busting in and doing raids. People do not have the time to make sure that the women are taken care of. So it's still this like sexist way of not seeing someone as co-human, but seeing them as and not seeing someone as an equal colleague. So that's something that was really startling, but it was also another point by saying that human trafficking, generally speaking, is a crime, according to the data collective, the CT data collective, that affects on average 70% of women and girls, as opposed to anyone else. So majority of the raids that you were going to, there are women there, traumatized women who are trafficking victims at that stage, and I'm going to say slash survivors, just not to just force people identities onto people. The last thing you want to actually see in most of the case is having to see a policeman that you don't know. You don't know that this person actually is here to help you and protect you and not harm you. Okay, that's like one of the side effects to trauma, and it's something that shows how intersectional this police force actually was. So it was determined that the police force is monolithic, static, and it actually is very unaccommodating to women. And it spoke of the fact that, and someone said, the gender expert actually said that there are in various organizations, before those organizations even open for operation. So sort of confirming what Joan Acker actually said, with organizations being primary divisive tools. Hegemonic, toxic, male-orientated means and measures to bar women from attaining higher positions within those organizations are met. The gender expert says, so one of the interviewees said, interestingly, there are also stereotypes that organizations often have. So when you are hiring certain people, you see with the people who are hired for certain positions that even if you as a woman would make that position, you would not, as a woman, you would not get that position, because everyone would assume that you're going to get pregnant in 6 months. And then after you get pregnant in 6 months, you're going to get pregnant again. Just those stereotypes that assuming that every single woman wants to have a child, every single woman's going to have a child through pregnancy, every single woman can't work and, be pregnant at the same time. So those were some of the interesting things that were found. A lot more was found, but for now, that was it. Some critiques for this research, and things that I wish I did better, and things that actually opened my eyes, was the fact that not all women want to live in a gender progressive society. Not every single woman wants gender equality. Not every woman is a feminist. Not any man is, and not every single man does not want a gender progressive society. So there's sort of that. Secondly, also, how realistic is systemic overarching supreme gender progression? What does that look like? We know on theory what does that look like, but if we had to put that within a very specialized hyper-masculine position, what the force rather, such as the Hawks SOCI force, what would that look like? And then an age-old question, how can you truly monitor gender equality, especially if consistent access to stats aren't possible, but also that was just one issue I faced. But if the stats you were getting aren't verifiable, if I can say that. Now the overarching research challenges, the biggest one was the data. I'm also pretty, I like numbers quite a few, so I like working with numbers, and I think they're pretty powerful. So I was a little bit upset that I couldn't work with quite a few numbers, and if I could do it again, I would definitely want to include a lot more, want to deep dive into the quantitative aspects of it. That is definitely where this research was lacking. Also, getting a hold of a current Hawks SOCI force representative. Yeah, I don't want to say government is notorious for being unreachable, but government is notorious for being unreachable. And also, this research had a word limit of 15 to 20,000 words. I think I got sucked into the topic, and it ended up being 87,000 words. So I had to cut out a lot of good information, which I would have liked to explore and shared with the public. But with all of that in mind, and with seeing that the Hawks SOCI force is monolithic, negative, and static, and that is anti-constitutional. What do we do now? Now we found that out. So the first thing to realize is that I think we need to work towards instilling equity and systemic change, as opposed to sort of just surface level responsive change. And yes, it's very, very ambitious, and it seems so idealistic and so far-fetched, but that's what change is. That's where, when you learn of big change makers, when you see a better society, it's always people who did the impossible and reached the presumably impossible. So that was really, really great, and I think that's really possible. So I think just changing our narrative, and this can start with even changing your language, because words mean stuff, words are powerful. The psychological effect that words have is really, really big. For instance, when I started this project, I would always be I would speak of police in a male gendered way. So I would say policeman, even when I was younger, that sort of thing. Where when I see a policeman, I'd be like, oh, obviously, that makes sense. A policewoman, that wouldn't really sit right. So those, like, just unlearning and just taking the responsibility to do that as an ethical person of society. But over and above that, SAPS also needs to include social sciences in all spheres of their operations, from decision making to coming up with policies to even taking a social sciences on the field, which I think is a little bit much, but I think it's important. I think social sciences are notorious for being looked down upon, but we hold a lot of, truth and, good society. We hold a lot of power in what equality actually looks like, and solutions for a more equitable society. For instance, here I was getting really frustrated because I was reading all of these things and being like, but we as a subs, we don't know what, like, youth, like a woman inclusive non-sexist society looks like. And it would be like, well, that's simple, and just include women and we can tell you what that looks like. Include gender experts who have the expertise of that and they can tell you what that looks like. So that's just, just a bit of quite massive changes, but things to do. Now, if we can quickly just pick up the A4 pieces of paper that we had, and if we can pick up number 2, the second one, that's what I mean. If we can pick up the second one, don't get rid of the first one, remember? And if we can just do the activity one more time. Now, hearing all of that, getting that information download, and having very, very like heavy heads, if we could just do that scenario once again. And as scenario 1 goes, you're at a police station, you're writing a statement, and you are basically giving you're given answers and some sort of evidence, verbal evidence, to a high-profile investigation. Who is the police officer that sits in front of you? And then number 2, high-level chase, high-speed, very on-the-ground type of policing. Who is the commanding officer who's in front of you? So if we can just jot down the same things. There's no right or wrong answer here. Well, I really, really hope that both of the things that you answered, your first question and your your answers to your first questions and the answers to the second questions, I hope that your page was either blank or that you couldn't answer what the gender was of the person that you saw, what the race was, and just the activity to get rid of assumptions and being like, policing isn't a gendered profession, and we need to move away from seeing things from a gendered lens or from a negatively gendered lens and look at it from seeing it in an intersectional gendered lens, but something that we can prove rather. So at the beginning of this research, I started off saying that I was like, I'm not someone who gets afraid of a lot of things, but I was very, very afraid of policemen in general. Like, I remember when I was younger and I stopped by police officers and with a couple of friends, and obviously we didn't do anything wrong, but I felt like this overwhelming amount of like fear. I remember also like just the little things that like my mom would tell me, if you're going out and you get stuck and you need a police officer, don't call the police officer first. You call, like my mom say, call her first or someone else first. So and it was sort of like these little things where I was like, the policemen of SAPS are really here to serve and protect women and gender non-conforming individuals of the state. And I was really upset at the beginning of the research, but at the end of the research, I remember Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's words where she says, gender matters everywhere in the world, and I would like today to say that we should begin to dream about and plan for a fairer world, a different world rather, a fairer world and a world of happier men and women who are true to themselves. And at the end, I can honestly say it's very hopeful, it's very ambitious, but I think if we don't have hope, we're not going to do that well as a society. And I think a fairer world could be having a more ethical SAPS, a better SAPS, a more inclusionary SAPS, a SAPS that isn't so aggressive and toxic towards women, children, and gender non-conforming individuals, and certain men, but is aggressive towards reforming gender discrimination throughout SAPS. So thank you so much. And I know that was a lot at once, but I hope you took something away, and I hope I challenged a couple of thoughts. Thanks, everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alwande. You've given us so much to think through in that very comprehensive presentation. So I think we have time for one round of questions. So feel free. It's a very small room today, so I think anyone with a question can just immediately unmute themselves and feel free to ask or to share their comments.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, comment from Essie, who says, thank you so much, Alwande. This was so informative. Okay, we have one hand. Prof. J.O.
Dr. Lambella, you can't out a person like this because I'm a guest, far removed.
You tried.
Alwande, thank you so much for your presentation. I took a particular kind of interest in your work, a very keen interest, because a couple of years ago, I was doing field work in 2 police stations in Cape Town, 3 months in one and 3 months in another. Ethnographic field work, and so spent time with them on day shift and night shift. And on some level, I was hoping that I would hear something different in terms of, in inverted commas, the culture of what you found. And in some ways, it's quite sad that it doesn't seem to have changed. But on another level, I also understand why. So I joined late, so I didn't hear the initial comments that you made. And so the comment I'm giving you here is in some ways out of context, okay? And I hope you would have covered it before. But I think one of the things for me, and Wani knows me like this, I've always looked for the human being in someone beyond the title. And during my fieldwork, I actually came to understand that the hypermasculine machismo way of being was not only something embodied by men, but also by women. And that based on the environment, it was very easy to step into it. And so, yeah, I'm just going to give you a personal example, okay? Actually, 2. So at the one station, which was considered to be a vacation station, so in other words, there wasn't a lot happening. Everybody would get overly excited if there was a robbery or something, and we'd be like, which van are we getting into? Come on, come on, come on. Because it was really slow. Okay, it was slow. So on a Friday night, they brought 3 or 4 young men in to the station. They were attempting to gain access to a warehouse. So they were kind of shoved and pulled, okay? And then they were told, remove your laces and remove your belts. And the one young man, understanding that they were now going to be put into a jail cell, started crying. Okay, so they couldn't have been more than what, 15, 16. So I'm saying young men, but these are teenagers, right? And he was crying, and the one police officer said, yeah, no, now you want to come and cry. Who are you crying for? And the other kid went, his mom, And as we walked him through to the cell, I found myself losing sight of their vulnerability. Okay. recognizing more that they were attempting to break in. And so I had framed them not as potential criminals, but as criminals. And so when they were shoved through the door unceremoniously, thankfully not to spend time with older men in the cells, I found myself going, really? Really? Am I now feeling sorry for them? What the hell? So that was one moment, okay, in this vacation station. Then another was when I went on patrol with a station that they call the strafstasie. So this is where if you didn't do things according to the book or protocol, you would be sent to the station. And it was literally seen as, what would it be? I can't translate it. It's sitting in my head. My brain's not working today. But you went to the station. Okay, so we went on patrol and we trying to deliver warrants of arrest, and they say to me, you've got the flak jacket, so for heaven's sakes, you don't have a gun, you with us, but can you just stay in the car? And I'm like, I become a target if I'm in the car. Like, can we just, like, where the hell is everybody going? So you're trying not to get in their way, and then you're listening to what they're saying, and you're going, is it because I'm a woman? But then you see, but no, the female police officer also said, hey, stay in the car. What are you wanting to do? Getting out? Like, can we just not? We don't want to be protecting you and not doing our job, right? And 2-3 hours into this, there was a man that had been shot. We went to the scene. It wasn't life-threatening, but I was still kind of like, are you okay? So they called me off, and I go to the man. He's laying on the ground, and he's like, you know, I mean, he's howling because, I mean, he's been shot in the leg. He's been attended to in some ways, and it's like, now we're just waiting for the ambulance. And I'm going, are you okay? You know, is there anything I can do? Like, hold pressure on the wound, wah, wah, wah. And the female police officer, who was a captain, says under breath, Joy's too caring, she's too soft. You would never survive this if you were with us. And so what I found was, even if you try to resist the environment in which you found yourself in, there were moments where you were pushed to be other than who you really are internally in order to survive. Okay, so there were times when it was imperative that you had to see the person in front of you as less than human, recognizing that your life and continuation of it is dependent on the people that you're working with. So you lose sight of yourself as a researcher in that moment, right? And you go, right, okay, so now I'm also a police officer. Because not only am I treated as such by respondents, but also the people they work with. So the communities we were in perceived me as a police officer. And I was also on the receiving end of some wonderful words, let me put it like that. Okay. So I'm interested, Alwande. I mean, yes, I hate this word culture, but I'm interested in understanding when a way of being, let me put it that way, when a way of being, or Foucault's word habitus, is so strong and is forged under the idea of danger and immediate danger and loss of life, right? How do you shift? How do you shift it to become more open, inclusive, gender progressive? So moving beyond the hope, what is it that they would have to do, whether it's in their training, so not just in terms of adding numbers only, not only adding women, because to me it felt like that habitus is so strong that women are pulled into it. It's very hard to resist it. And in a very short space of time, it doesn't take too long before you start becoming a little bit more man-like. I don't know what the word is there, but you know, more man than the men. Yeah, I'm going to leave it there. There was a lot.
Thank you so much, Prof. Owen. Okay, we have, are there any other questions? We have still a bit of time, and I would prefer if people go at once. But I think if if people are still formulating theirs, I'll go. So I think mine builds on Professor Owen's point. So I'm still copying you years, nearly over a decade after being a student. So I am actually going to phrase it backwards because I wanted to ask about the sort of intimacies, right? And I use intimacy broadly here, not just sexual intimacies, which is sort of the ways in which a lot of the times when people write about the police, they'll talk about the ways in which women police service the women police are sexually harassed at work and so on. But I'm also thinking about the ways in which we ourselves are so intimate, right? So I have, relatives, close relatives, including my brother, who is in the South African police service. And it's always very interesting when you look at South African conversations around the police because, and this links again to sort of, I guess, the second point I wanted to make, which is the South African police service, I think, is unique in some ways in South Africa, particularly when you compare it to the global north. And there's quite a lot of writings by the likes of Cornell around how, like, the police service tends to already attract people who, in one form or another, are already traumatized, right, or are dealing with some kind of interpersonal, or have dealt with some kind of trauma. So in South Africa, you just need a matric certificate, right, to become a police officer, and the likelihood is high that you likely didn't get into university, didn't have particular kinds of marks. So already it's a very class-based, right, profession where someone might already come from impoverished background. They themselves might have experienced various forms of trauma and so on. And I guess where I'm trying to link it with the intimacy is how do we negotiate, I guess, because I think, and this is not a critique to you, but so much of the focus is structural, right, in your work, which is women's experiences already within the police service, but also I've never experienced the police in any positive term, even as a black man, and it's always uncomfortable because it was always other black men who were black male policemen who were racially profiling me, assuming I've stolen something and so on. But I guess, and then it's interesting because I go also into an intimate space where then I deal with my brother, who is also part of this larger force. So I guess I'm wondering how in your work you're thinking around that aspect of it, which is that it's of course important to also look at women's experiences in the police service, but it's also, I guess, there's this personal aspect to the police as well that so many of us also have to grapple with, which is they're not just there, but they're also people within your own life. But I don't want to take too much time. Feel free to respond if there's no other question. I think you're muted, Alwande.
Sure. Sorry about that. Is it better now? Am I unmuted?
We can hear.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So the first question was, thank you for that question. It was, there was a bit there, but it was sort of looking at it, and there was a couple of comments there looking at, please excuse me for the language, I'm going to be very raw, censored, but raw, but women being gatekeepers of sexism and patriarchy and all of that. And that, I think, is probably one of the most something in feminism that we need to actually look at a lot more, is that we need to stop gendering justice. I mean, for me, I classify feminism as justice. And whenever you were saying that only certain people can be certain things, the power and the damage that assumption can do is really, really damaging. I think when you look, and I'm going to link link them together. But when you look at the fact that a police officer is a human being who is also a part of the society that they are helping to create. That's something that needs to be taken into consideration. And as you said, Doctor, you said a lot of the police officers do come from traumatized backgrounds, and that is something that is said if every single time anyone speaks of the SAPs, is that police officers are not catered for. Police officers are also re-traumatized by not only the work that they do, but the circumstances that they come from, and that have a lot of the time pushed them into that work. You know, I'm yet to meet a police officer who wanted to become a SAPS police officer, and I'm sure they are, but it's just whole framing of how the South African society has been structured, and I'm not too sure how to really authentically do justice to that. That would definitely require a lot more research. I don't know how that research would look like. I would have to research how that research would look like, but I think what we do a lot of the times, and this was one of my critiques for BLM, was even when it came to SA and when South Africa like jumped on the wave of it, was that people were jumping on the bandwagon of assuming that automatically you as a police officer are an incorrect, unjust, inhumane human being. Whereas you were sort of like, but you take the person who is a police officer who's doing that. And I used to check myself so much when I was doing this research by saying, I'm assuming so much. I'm assuming that every single person out there is going to be anti-woman. I'm assuming that every single woman is going to want SAPs to change, going to want SAP to be more inclusionary, when that's not necessarily true. And I think the minute we have failed as society is when we stop having conversations with one another, respectful conversations, whereby we actually say, wait, what do you want? You are a policewoman in that force. How do you feel that this force, works for you and works with you? And also, policemen, how do you feel that this force works with you and works for you? And yeah, I think, I don't know, I just don't like it when people come at other people for being too soft with certain things and start telling people you need to not look at the humanity and just look at the person, that this person is a criminal and that's what they are and that's the end of it. And I think a good example would be the unrest that happened in South Africa, the unrest that currently happened, where the world went berserk around that and was saying, arrest all of those people who are criminals. It was disgusting. What they did was out of this world, when there were some people who were honestly just so sick and tired of their socio-economic position that when they got an opportunity to access food, yeah, they were opportunistic, but access food and stuff, they took that. And that's not necessarily making them, yeah, they're doing a criminal act, but are they really criminals? Do you know what I mean? So just the framing and the assumption, I think, is where we're going wrong, where we put people in these boxes and we assume their identities, we assume what they believe in and what they don't believe in, and that's a big problem. I used to get into arguments, and my feminists are going to come for me, where I honestly believe that men can be feminists. I used to be shut down for saying that all the time, because they'll be like, no, it's impossible, it's this, and their arguments did hold a lot of weight, but you are assuming already that someone, because they belong to a certain gender, is A, B, and C, although there's a lot of evidence that will, point towards and support that. So I don't really have the answers to any questions. I'm sorry, but I'm definitely looking forward to sort of learning and researching a lot more on that, or even starting maybe another one on that. And listen, I also have, I have an uncle, I don't know if he's still a police officer, but he's a police officer, and I think when you have a personal relative and you have the opportunity to humanize the situation and personalize it, you actually start to understand it from different perspectives. And obviously that's not the reality for all of us, but it's this whole thing of being like, as a society, we've been so detached from seeing each other as co-human beings. you know, and I've butchered that term to death today, but we've been so detached from that, where we are literally just, it's just this toxic hustle grinding culture where you're just living to survive as opposed to living to, you know, just enjoy life and thrive with one another.
Lovely. I definitely think you must continue with this topic to your masters, and if you need a supervisor, hint, hint. Okay, if there's any, we have just a few minutes left, but if there's a last burning comment or question, gotta give an opportunity for that. But if not, then you can sort of close us off. Let's give it 10 seconds. 10, 9, 8.
Yeah, I absolutely. I will support Alwande there in terms of continuing this. I think you've got the start of something. Okay, I'm not going to say it. As an elder, let me give you advice though. This work is heavy. It's heavy. Okay. So do the necessary. If you're taking this into your masters, and I can hear there's a potential PhD as well, because there's very little being done on the SAPS at the moment. You need to be able to vent. You need to create a support system that will hold you. Okay, because this is heavy work, and the heaviness doesn't just come 2 months, 3 months down the line when you're doing research. It's from day one. Okay, so make sure that you've got someone's a supportive network, people who understand and so can cater to the emotional fallout that does happen. Okay, that's one, because you will lose respondents in the field, and that's something you have to deal with. The second thing, and maybe you would want to consider this also as part of, in inverted commas, the cultural frame that they are using. When I spoke even to one of the senior police officers, he said to me, "Joy, you need to understand, we do provide the psychological services. You know, we have social workers, we have psych people. We even, if they say to us they're Catholic, you know, we do the necessary to find a priest or whatever. They do not take us up on the offer." And I asked why, and he said, "Oh, I don't know, you'd have to ask them." And when I spoke to the rank and file, in inverted commas, right, they said to me very clearly, if you want to be promoted, you cannot have on your record that you sought out psychological services, because then you are not seen as capable of, you're not seen as resilient. So that's one of the aspects that you need to keep in mind. Okay, so there's been an attempt in terms of providing interventions, assistance, but they've been resisted by the rank and file. Okay, and that's just my 2 cents. I'm excited. I look forward to your work.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you for that advice.
Lovely. Okay, I wonder, we have 5 minutes left, so feel free to close us off. But on behalf of Gauteng Anthro, I want to thank everyone who managed to join us today. And I think we all learned a lot, and I think everyone can agree we want more of this work. And I think it's so important that, as I've said to you so many times, that someone like you actually is doing this work. And I think the nuances already, as we can see in the conversations, add so much more depth. So please, yes, bless us with the masters, the PhD, and the book.
Done. Thank you. Thank you so much for the platform, and I honestly just believing in my research and directly believing in me. I really, really appreciate it. And I mean, look, there's a support system already here, so I appreciate that so, so much. And I think I want everyone to take this and sort of process everything, but also not to be deterred from really just sticking an essay, you know, really helping, contributing to the positive change and development of here, because it's worth it. This country is worth it, and you know, we do deserve an equitable society. And thank you so much to Gauteng Anthro. You guys are amazing. I really, really, really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
Lovely. Thanks all. Have a great Thursday.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.